I'm Jen Moore, and I've set up shop once again here in my home to discuss the fourth program in Music of the Baroque's 50th season, Bach's Brandenburg Concertos. Here in Chicago with us for the first time since November 2019, principal guest conductor Nicholas Kramer leads three concertos from this famous collection: Brandenburg Concertos No. 3 and 6 for string ensemble, and Brandenburg Concerto No. 5 for harpsichord, flute, violin, strings, and continuo. In March, Music of the Baroque ventured into the classical era as soloist Enon Barnaton joined us for Mozart's rarely performed Piano Concerto No. 14, and also gave what we believe is a North American premiere of Mozart's recently discovered Allegro in D major. The program, which can be viewed on demand until May 1st, also included Mozart's Symphony No. 29 and music of Handel, all under the direction of Dame Jane Glover. For this concert, we move back firmly into the Baroque era with music by Johann Sebastian Bach, one of the greatest Baroque composers. Written in an attempt to secure a job, Bach's Brandenburg Concertos number among his best-loved compositions. I've talked about the concerto and concerto grosso forms quite a bit this season, so I'll touch on them only briefly before I talk specifically about the three Brandenburg concertos the orchestra will be performing. Instrumental music came into its own during the Baroque era, which we generally define as starting in 1600 with the birth of opera and ending around 1750 with the death of Bach. This illustrates exactly how important Bach is in the period. The Concerto Grosso, a multi-movement work for a group of soloists called the concertino and ensemble, or ripieno, was one of the most important genres of instrumental music that sprang on the scene during this time. The most modern concerti grossi, which is the correct plural, are written in three movements with contrasting tempos: fast, slow, fast. In addition to contrasting tempos, the form centers around other kinds of sharp contrasts as well: soft and loud dynamics, solo and ensemble textures, different instrumental colors, and so on. The six Brandenburg concertos are all concertos of some sort, though each brings out a different facet of the genre. Let's turn now to Johann Sebastian Bach, who was born in 1685, the same year as Handel, and died in 1750, which, as I just discussed, marking the end of the Baroque era. While we think of Bach today as a creative genius, Bach probably thought of himself as a good employee as much as a talented musician, and his musical output was largely circumscribed by the places where he worked. From about 1703 to 1717, his jobs involved playing the organ in places like Arnstadt and Weimar, so he wrote many of his organ compositions during this period. From 1717 to 1723, he was at Prince Leopold's court in Curtin. Prince Leopold loved instrumental music, and he had an excellent ensemble, and Bach composed many of his orchestral works for him. And it was in Leipzig, for the Thomaskirche, that he wrote his cantatas and passions. Not all of Bach's music falls into these categories, the Brandenburg concertos included, but there is an obvious correlation between his musical output and what was required of him professionally. There are many things we do not know about the six Brandenburg concertos, and first, we do not know exactly when they were written. The fact that they are technically challenging suggests that Bach composed them in Curtin for Prince Leopold's ensemble, but the collection's descriptive title, Brandenburg Concertos, hints at a reality that is much more mundane. Although Bach had been happy in his post, the court's location was remote. Some even referred to it mockingly as cow curtain. The court was experiencing budget troubles, and school crowding was also an issue, which must have been important to a father of an ever-increasing number of children. A 1722 memo addresses not only a shortage of teachers, but also class sizes that exceeded 100. It was time for a new job, and the Brandenburg Concertos, dedicated in 1721 to Christian Ludwig, the Margrave of Brandenburg, probably served as an elaborate musical resume. As Bach expressed in the dedication, "As I had the honor of playing before your Royal Highness a few years ago, and as I observed that you took some pleasure in the small talent that Heaven has given me for music, and in taking leave of your Royal Highness you honored me with a command to tend you some pieces of my composition, I now, according to your Royal Highness, take the liberty of presenting my very humble respect to your Royal Highness, with the present concertos, which I have written for several instruments, humbly praying you do not judge their imperfection by the severity of the fine and delicate taste that everyone knows you to have for music, but rather to consider benignly the profound respect and the very humble obedience to which they are meant to testify. For the rest, Monseigneur, I very humbly beg your Royal Highness to have the goodness to continue your good graces toward me, and to be convinced that I have nothing so much at heart as the wish to be employed in matters more worthy of you and your service. Although the Margrave may have appreciated Bach's efforts and even paid him for his work, he didn't give him a job. The delayed compensation, of course, is that the Brandenburg Concertos are now among Bach's most well-loved and admired compositions. While the Brandenburg Concertos were dedicated in 1721, they probably were not all written that year. One factor used to identify when they were composed is style. The third and sixth Brandenburgs are both ripieno, or ensemble concertos. The ripieno concerto belonged to the age of Corelli and Albinoni and was ultimately superseded by the solo concerto upon its innovation by Vivaldi around 1713. The fact that Bach used this more old-fashioned form suggests that the third and sixth concertos may have been composed before 1713. Let's listen to a bit of Brandenburg No. 3. The third Brandenburg is written for 3 choirs of strings. These are all similar sounding instruments without the contrast of a brass instrument like the trumpet or a wind instrument like the flute. Unlike the traditional concerto grosso, which uses a distinct group of soloists against the entire ensemble, the 9 string parts are essentially equal in difficulty, which is what makes it an ensemble concerto. Every player becomes a soloist at some point during the piece. The variety in contrast comes not from the tone color of individual instruments, but instead from many subtle contrasts between solo, small group, and ensemble. Let's listen to how this happens in the first movement of Brandenburg 3. In the opening measures, the main theme is presented. Bach then takes this theme and breaks it up into pieces, sprinkling them around the ensemble. After the main theme, for example, the opening 6-note phrase is passed from the violins to the violas and then to the cellos. The 3 violins have a brief moment of imitation before the entire ensemble comes back in unison. These subtle and intricate contrasts are incredibly compelling. A quick aside about the slow movement. It is comprised of only 2 chords, and it was probably used as a moment for improvisation. Nicholas Kramer did this in his 2011 recording with Music of the Baroque. Kramer conducts Bach and Telemann, and the recordings of Brandenburg Concerto No. 3 and No. 6 that I'm using are actually from that CD. Here's a condensed version of his harpsichord improvisation. Conductors today often substitute a movement in the same key from another of Bach's works. For this performance, Nicholas Kramer will be using the Largo from the Sonata in G major for violin and harpsichord. As Kramer notes, the cadence at the end is the same as what Bach provides for the middle movement of Brandenburg Concerto No. 3, so the string ensemble will join the violin and harpsichord for these 2 chords. a condensed version of this movement now with James Ennis on violin and Luc Beauséjour on harpsichord. The Sixth Brandenburg Concerto is also an ensemble concerto, but for a very unusual ensemble. 2 violas, 2 viola da gamba, cello, and continuo. With this concerto, we have another alleged marker of chronology. Not only is Bach using an old-fashioned form, but he's also using the viola da gamba, a relatively obsolete instrument. The idea that style is something that constantly moves forward in isolation from the context in which a piece is written, and that we can identify when something was written based on this timeline, may not be accurate. In his book on Telemann, Music for a Mixed Taste, Stephen Zahn suggests that it is best to compare Bach's music to what other composers of his time were doing, rather than to some notion of stylistic development. We might believe that the Ripieno Concerto was outmoded by 1721, for example, but Bach and Telemann's contemporaries didn't necessarily think that way. Other composers were still using the form, and Telemann, who is generally thought to be the most fashionable of them all, wrote several such pieces right around the same time. The use of the viola da gamba has contemporary validity too. Bach's employer at Curtin, Prince Leopold, played the gamba, so Bach may well have been intentionally writing a piece in which Leopold could participate. This is the thing about Bach. He is so important historically that it's easy to forget that he was also very much a product of his time and place. The Brandenburg Concertos may be better viewed as a reflection of the rich musical times in which Bach worked, rather than as a compendium of musical styles. This may make it harder to determine precise composition dates, but it sheds much more light on the colorful palette that enlivened the landscape of 18th century German music. Now, let's listen to the opening movement of Brandenburg Concerto No. 6, especially noting the rich, dusky colors the use of the low strings and muted gambas create. The final concerto on the program, Brandenburg Concerto No. 5, is probably the boldest of them all. The fifth Brandenburg is a concerto grosso with a concertino group consisting of flute, violin, and harpsichord, plus the ensemble, strings, and continuo. It was very unusual to use the harpsichord as a solo instrument. Given that Bach was a talented keyboard player, it isn't surprising that he was the one who led the charge in liberating the harpsichord from its traditional role. During his time in Curtin, Bach wrote several sonatas for multiple instruments in which the harpsichord is an equal partner, and he innovated the harpsichord concerto while in Leipzig. The fifth Brandenburg is sometimes described as the very first keyboard concerto, and as one listens to the first movement, the reason for this becomes clear. As it unfolds, the harpsichord's bravura statements become more restless and intense, suddenly erupting in a strikingly virtuosic, unaccompanied episode that transgresses all boundaries of genre, harmony, and rhythm. This solo has attracted a lot of attention. Musicologist Susan McClary wrote an essay called The Blasphemy of Talking Politics During Bach Year, in which she labels it as a moment of liberation, a point at which Bach subverts social expectation by thrusting a member of the support staff into the limelight. It's not simply a virtuosic turn, it's actually an act of rebellion. Rock musician Andrew W.K., who once tried to start a political party known as the Party Party, talks about the harpsichord solo as having all the thrills, theatrics, and drama of a massive electric guitar shred fest, and he takes it even a bit further. I like to imagine that the feelings Bach was trying to manifest were the equivalent feelings to what a hard rock band is trying to create. Pure joy, a total rush of energy without ideas, concepts, or even specific emotions to stand in the way of the total sonic experience. It's everything and nothing, and a mystery and a revelation all at once. This kind of anachronistic comparison gets at what's special about this piece for me. Like most composers of his day, Bach was an employee. He wrote what he was supposed to write, and he excelled beyond belief within these parameters. In the Fifth Brandenburg Concerto, he mixes rebellion, virtuosity, and a few minutes of complete freedom in a way that almost feels closer to guitar shredding, like Eddie Van Halen's Eruption, than anything classical. You won't hear any electric guitar in our performance of the 3rd, 5th, and 6th Brandenburg Concertos. You will, however, hear the talented music of the Baroque Orchestra deliver virtuosic performances of great music by Bach. I hope I've given you a few things to think about as you listen to Bach's Brandenburg Concertos, streamed live on April 26th and available on demand from April 29th through May 29th. Thank you so much.